So, David, I think the first thing would be to just get you to introduce yourself and say your title and how long you were there, and then I'll ask you what led to you assuming that position.
Right. Well, my name's David Edwards, and I came to Derby Playhouse in 1978. I had up to that point been the general manager at the Gateway Theatre in Chester, and I saw Derby as being, the next rung up the theatre ladder. But my original title was administrative director, working alongside a resident director of productions, who at that time was Mark Woolgar. By the time I left, 24 years later, in 2002, I'd had several job titles. I'd been through 4 artistic directors, and I ended up as being chief executive.
What's interesting is that I can see behind you pictures that look quite arty. Are you somebody who was very much into drama at school? Was that a motivation to theatre land?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose when I was at school, I did a lot of acting, and I went to the local theatre. I lived in Ipswich, and I used to go to the local theatre there. And I suppose I thought that I wanted to work in the theatre. I suppose I thought I wanted to be an actor in those innocent days. I studied drama at university at Bristol, and I had the idea of being an actor knocked out of me fairly early on. And I got interested in the management side. So it was something that I felt very much at home doing.
And when you jumped into that particular role, what were you told was the mission that you were meant to deliver? You know, football management terms, you're either told to play attacking football or park the bus, get bums on seats. What was your mission?
Well, I don't think in 1978 they talked about missions. And certainly by the time I left, we were talking about missions. And I think that we had a fairly clear mission. I think at one time we actually used the strap line, theatre for all. And that didn't mean that it would be theatre for all the time, but that over the course of a season, you would have something put on your stage that would appeal to people of all tastes and backgrounds and interests. But we also had studio theatre, we had theatre and education, we had community touring. So we were trying to get out to, as many people as possible. So I suppose if there was a mission, it was something like theatre for all. And of course, back in 1978, we still had the Derby Film Theatre as part of our programme. So there was quite a lot going on. And that offered sort of a variety of things for the citizenship of Derby and Derbyshire. We were very close to Nottingham, of course, also had a sort of, there's been a sort of a synergy, I think, between what goes on in Nottingham Playhouse and what went on in Derby Playhouse, and the awareness that for people who lived in between, there was choice. So you wanted to kind of make sure that you weren't necessarily copying what Nottingham were doing, or that you could create your own buzz, your own image that people would feel loyal to.
Interesting.
I suppose all those things I was charged with doing.
Yeah, I think the rivalry between Derby and Nottingham, that's extended beyond theatre land into football. And around the time you mentioned there, 78, 79, I think a certain Nottingham Forest team had some particular success that left a taste in Derby fans, but we'll not dive into that for now. You mentioned film, and that's something that's quite interesting for me, having my film hat connection in terms of what is now Quad and what was previously the Metro. I was there on the management committee at Metro in the sort of 90s, around that time, and we always talked about the cultural offer in Derby and how attractive it was or not for people. What was your favourite show around the time you were involved at the theatre over those years? Are you able to pick out one or two? Well,
I had a fairly eclectic taste, really. I like sort of good storytelling. So if a sort of a story is told well, be it a classic play or a modern play, I would like that. I love comedy, because I think there's nothing better than being in a full house of people laughing at a show, and that really is a great boost. And of course, we're all missing that now, aren't we?
Absolutely.
But I suppose what I did come to enjoy were the musicals. We did the odd musical in the early days when I was there, but it wasn't until Mark Clements joined as artistic director in the 90s. He came to me one day when we were talking about planning for the next season, and he said he would like to do Grease. I said, how many people are in that? How many people would you need in the band? And we did a few sums. And I said, I don't think we can possibly afford to do that. Far too big a scale show. And he said, you wait and see, it will sell out. And all those extra seats above your budgeted 50% or whatever it was will help to pay for it. He sold it to me along those lines. So we scheduled it. And of course, it had a I don't know, three and a half week run, and we sold every seat, and it was a fantastic show. And that led on to a number of other musicals. And I suppose the biggest risk that we did was to do Chorus Line, which had an enormous cast, something like 20 of, and a big band. And we had to get permission from Equity to use a lot of local extras from the community theatre, because we couldn't afford to pay Equity rates to everybody in the show. And again, it sold out, and it was absolutely fantastic. It looked terrific. We had some amazing performances, some great choreography. So I suppose, of all the shows in my time there, that's the one that I will take away with me. But some of the community theatre shows that Pete Meakin directed, for example, some of the amateur shows, certainly towards the end of my time, we were scheduling a lot more amateur theatre, which sort of suited us because it sort of fitted slots in the year that we couldn't do ourselves. But it also suited the local amateur theatre community. I think Derby is has one of the strongest amateur theatre communities in the country. And of course, the Playhouse was the obvious place for them to come and perform. So a lot of those were very memorable too.
It's interesting you mentioned the local theatre connection in Derby, because I remember seeing things like the Mountaintop and the Billie Holiday show in the little studio theatre there.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the Playhouse or the theatre then, but it was a fantastic show. And those are the things that I think help to show the community that there is somebody thinking about how they can be engaged with it, because I think we can't look at life and see theatre as not being reflective of life, can we?
Well, that's right. I mean, if you're going to see a good show, can actually change the way you see the world. And it sounds a bit of a cliche to say it, but that's one of the sort of the wonderful thing about theatre, that you can go and see a good show and you can be entertained, but if it actually relates to things that you are experiencing in your life, it can help change your perspective on that. And it's it's life-changing, life-enhancing and life-changing potentially.
Absolutely. What's that phrase? Life is art and art is life. I think is something along those lines.
That Billie Holiday show was fantastic. I think we revived it. And Mark was very keen that we should take it to the Edinburgh Festival, and we did try to set that up, but it actually became far too much of a risk for us to do, and sadly it never happened.
Well, I was going to ask about the biggest challenges in theatre when you look at somewhere like Derby. How do you balance the books, the bums on seats, with the theatrical excellence that everybody wants involved in Theatreland? And how did you, as a director of that sort of ship, sail through those choppy waters?
Well, we certainly had choppy waters, Devon, during my time there, as anybody who was around at that time will know. The financial model that we operated is really no longer sustainable, and it was certainly becoming clear towards the end of my time there that it was going to be unsustainable. The whole concept of a regional theatre like Derby Bay has, which was copied throughout the country in most decent sized towns, there would be a regional theatre who employed the actors and the artists and the craftspeople you needed to put on that show or that season of shows. So of course at Derby we had permanent members of staff on the payroll who were carpenters, who were wardrobe people, who were props makers, who were electricians, who were sound people, as well as all the sort of the admin, the front of house, the marketing teams and so on. So it's actually very labor heavy, and so therefore very expensive. And then you're mounting several different shows a year. We were doing, at one point, we were doing 8 shows a year. So each of those had a different stage set, a different set of costumes, set of props, and so on. And the concept of the individual regional theatre was that it created an identity because it was using those same craftspeople, those same artists, designers and directors on that series of shows, as opposed to a touring house where you don't employ any of those people at all, but you buy in the touring product and you get what you get. It may not always be possible for you to get top quality stuff or the sort of material that you would want to have in your program. So what happened during the 80s, during the sort of the Thatcher period, if you like, was that the real value of the theatre investment that we got from our funders was becoming less and less in real terms. In the early 80s, we lost Derbyshire County Council funding altogether. And I know that latterly Derby City Council funding has gone altogether, but at the time, I mean, they were relatively supportive. They weren't as generous as some other local authorities, but then the income the city were getting from the rates, I suppose, wasn't as great as it would be in a much larger city, for example, like Birmingham or Leeds or whatever. So we became much more reliant, if we were going to balance the books, on box office, and that had an impact on what you chose to put on. I would say to our artistic director, okay, in this coming season, we need to increase the amount we generate from the box office because the value of the subsidy is going down in relation to our overheads and our running costs. So our shows have got to generate, say 70% this year, not 60% like last year. So that immediately means you've got to try and find shows that are going to be much more popular and are going to get the bums on seats. So that means that some of the more interesting or perhaps avant-garde work, which would appeal to a minority of your audience, has to be put on one side. It meant that a lot of the things that didn't generate an income, like the community touring and the theatre and education work from the early 80s, that went all together quite early on, very sadly. There was a lot of emphasis on generating more support from the business community through commercial sponsorship and other sorts of investment. And that was tricky for us in Derby, I think, because there weren't, unlike in many of the bigger cities, there weren't the big commercial companies that were interested in either supporting you from a philanthropic basis. We'll support you because we think you're making a good contribution to our community, or from marketing. One of the things we used to say to companies was, well, you know, you attach your name to a show at Derby Playhouse, you will get to be seen by a lot of people. It would be good for your marketing profile. But again, the number of companies who were themselves, I suppose, finding challenging times, who were prepared to risk that investment was not very great.
It's interesting you talking about that conundrum, that cash conundrum, if you like, because around the sort of early noughties, I was involved with a DCMS, Department for Culture, Media and Sport, Culture Consortium. It's an archive project that we're talking about today, and I was inspired to dig into my archive and found this book, very glossy 40-page booklet articulating some of the challenges that theatres like Derby and Nottingham faced, being medium-sized cities compared to the metropolises of London and Manchester, etc. Despite all those challenges, what's meant theatre is so special for you, David, and what have you enjoyed about your time in Theatreland the most?
Well, I think I suppose what I enjoyed most was being part of a creative team and putting together shows from scratch and then putting them in front of an audience, and you sort of almost hold your breath on the opening night because you've been involved with it. Well, not so much me, because I was more in the office counting up the money, but as a company, you have worked together from scratch. You've built the set, you've made the costumes, you've rehearsed the actors, you put it all together, and you don't know. You'll get some advance bookings, of course, because you have a loyal audience who will come, but you don't know until it opens whether or not the media are going to like it and say, you know, this is great. There was somebody who used to write for the Derby Evening Telegraph, and quite often he would say, this isn't for Derby. I don't know why they're doing this. This is not for Derby people. And we'd say, why not? Why not? But you have a good opening night, and the buzz of an opening night, of course, is always terrific. And then hopefully it's a success, because you've only got, well, in those days, like 3 weeks of that show to make your money. We used to do a lot of co-productions. That was another strand that we investigated in order to help spread the cost. So 2 or sometimes even 3 theatres would kind of buy into the project, and we always like to be the lead player because we like to have the artistic control to maintain the standard. But the 3 theatres, say, or sometimes 2, would share all the upfront costs. And that enabled us to do shows which was perhaps a little bit more, well, of a larger scale than we could have done had we done it on our own. And with Mark Clements, we did 2 or 3 productions, co-productions with a theatre in Philadelphia in the US, which was another exciting sort of strand to our work, a touch of sort of, you know, international work.
That's interesting, that model, because one of the productions that I was really intrigued to see at Derby Theatre was the Noughts and Crosses play, which was written by Mallory Blackman and was a co-production between Derby and I think Belgrade Theatre in Coventry. Right. And I was particularly interested in that because my son was reading that book at the time in year 9 or something. And that intrigued me, that kind of work had made it onto the stage at a theatre like Derby and had the potential to engage my young son and other young people locally with the story and, you know, that wider conversation being embraced by the local community. I think that sums up why I love theatre so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what I'll do now, David, if you don't mind, is have a pause so that I can go and get my little 9-year-old from school so she's not standing at the gate like Billy No Mates.
Absolutely.
I'll stop this and send it to Caroline, and then she can feed back to us. What I'll do is when I get back from the school lunch in about 20 minutes, I'll text her in the meantime and say, have a look, see what you think, and then she can let us know if we need to carry on either later today or tomorrow, whichever works for you.
Okay, right.
Is that right?
So, bye for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to see you, David. Nice
Take
to
care.
chat.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.